Hi everyone, and welcome back. This is our second presentation about Anthem by Ayn Rand, the book that she said she named Anthem because it was a hymn to man's ego. So before watching this video, please make sure, if you're in my class, that you take a look at the first video. In the first video, I talked a lot about communism and the Russian Revolution and Ayn Rand's life, but a lot more about her philosophy of objectivism and how that sort of shaped, how objectivism was shaped by her experiences with the Russian Revolution, and then in turn how her philosophy comes out in her books. So this is a quote here about communism. Communism is using force to reallocate economic resources to the workers. Such a massive undertaking requires massive amounts of centralized power. We talked a lot before about the reallocation of economic resources and also centralizing not just power, but the land that the peasants were working on, right? Which is something that happens hundreds of years before Anthem takes place. Decentralization is anathema to communism because decentralization implies inequality. In other words, when you have decentralization of those resources, giving them back to the people, it cannot exist, anathema, cannot exist at the same time as communism because there's inequality. From each according to their ability implies the ability to take anything from anyone. So when you say from each according to their ability, essentially what you're saying is that it's not just about the reallocation of economic resources. It's about the reallocation of things like intelligence or talent or skill. Somebody has not just land, but let's say someone has scientific knowledge, or someone else might have literary knowledge, right? If you're taking from people according to their ability, then that is what needs to happen for everyone to be the same. And an extreme satire of this can be found in Kurt Vonnegut's short story Harrison Bergeron. I'm going to put that in the folder, a link to that story in the folder for Anthem, so that you can, if you want to, you can read that story as well. So the historian here continues to say, islands of political power would thus result in islands of uncontrolled wealth, and more importantly, islands of political opposition to the central state. Thus, pluralism is anathema to communism. Any independence implies inequality, as people use their freedom to become better off than others. So pluralism meaning more than one ruler, right? In a democratic society, we have people who are the rulers of their own households, not just the rulers of the state. And then you have cities and states that sort of, in the United States, we somewhat work independently and somewhat work dependently. But what the historian is saying here is that if you don't reallocate economic resources, you're going to have these islands of people where you have political power, economic power, and that would be in opposition to the central state. So you can't have independence and an inequality. Independence means inequality. And if people have freedom, they'll use that freedom to try to become better than others. And that's sort of the central idea to this book. What she's showing in the novel Anthem is that there's been a reallocation of economic resources, there's been a centralization of power, and because of that, it's not just people's land that's been taken away, or the way that where they're living that's been changed. Really what's been taken away are their abilities, their talents, their intelligence, their independence, and ultimately their freedom. So let's take a look at the actual story. Part 1. Part 1 of the slide, not part 1 of the book. So the book is set up this way. In the future, the world has fallen into a second dark age. Now, we talked in the first presentation about what communism looks like in some countries right now, where we could see this dystopia or shades of this dystopia, and also what science looked like in the Soviet Union. That there were technological advancements, but really the type that the state wanted. So looking at things like the space program or nuclear weapons, as opposed to things like medicine or genetics or psychology. The novel takes place years after this unnamed event or trend that caused this issue. So in a sense, history has also been forgotten. The concept of the individual is erased. People have no real names or identities, and there's a dominant belief in collectivism. That's the concept that we have been talking about, right? Collecting all of the land, all of the resources, and then dividing it equally. So the sacrifice of the individual for the good of the group. And sacrifice is something that Ayn Rand was, if you looked at her objectivism philosophies, sacrifice is something that she's very opposed to. I think, when you take that further, then you're talking about altruism and being opposed to something like that, generosity. Which might not really work in a functional society if no one was generous or altruistic. But at the same time, when you have, I think her idea here really is important, that individuals should not be sacrificed just for the good of the group. Sorry, my computer seems to be a little stuck here. There we go. So the story part 2. That part 1 slide sort of shows you the setup, right? How the society is structured. We have extreme communism. Everyone's been taken from everyone else. Everyone is completely equal, which means that there's no individuality. So, a heroic young man named Equality 72521 begins to yearn for something more out of this society. He finds a girl, Liberty 53000, and he calls her, writing with a mouse here, the golden one. I forgot to put that in there. He begins calling her the golden one. He believes that Liberty is like him, searching for meaning in a world where all signs of difference have been oppressed. Equality starts doing scientific work, but very rudimentary scientific work. He's trying to search to discover something that has been banned. And most scientific work has been banned, and it's strictly controlled by councils. And when his work's discovered, no, I'm not going to give away the end. But his work is actually discovered before the end of the book, but after that point, I kind of would like you to find out what happens from there. So the science in this science fiction, this is something I'm going to be talking about for each one of the books. It's a picture from the Flat Earthers Society. It's how they think the Earth looks with it on a disc that we sort of all travel around. The science in this book, there's been a scientific devolution. So as opposed to the evolution of science, things have gone backwards. Relics have been banned, and they'll talk a lot in the book about relics and ruins. So the ruins are the old society, the leftovers of the old society. If you think of something today like the Parthenon, right, in ancient Roman and Greek ruins that we still sort of have and go through and look at today, right? You can also, in the United States, go on tours through southern plantations, like the houses that are still sort of there, right, and preserving history. in this case, history has also been banned in addition to science, as I said previously. So what happened before isn't completely clear, and it's not clear if scientific knowledge, perhaps it was suppressed, or if it was just lost. It seems that scientific knowledge may have been suppressed at first, and now, because it was suppressed by this highly collectivized, centralized government, that eventually all of that scientific knowledge was lost. So books are banned, and then eventually books are just left in the ruins, and then eventually we forget that there were books altogether, right? So if there's some kind of a war or a war between states that led to this communist government, or if it was just a communist government that, like the Soviet Union, started to take over the countries that were nearby. That's not clear. But what is clear, these are some modern ruins, and this is sort of how I picture the ruins in the book. An old abandoned factory, right? A sign of when we had industrialization in this country as opposed to farming it out to other countries. So everything is run in a very strict hierarchy. We talked about the hierarchy of communism last time. So you have kind of this triangular type of deal where the World Council is very small at the top, and then you have the State Council, and then you have the City Council, then you have the councils underneath that, and then you have all the workers. Sorry, again, I'm trying to write with a mouse. Sorry about that. So the workers are kind of all down at the bottom being run by these various governments. There are no families, and this is important as well. Scientifically, families are, sociologically speaking rather, families are the bedrock of any society. So you usually start from the bottom up. You have a family, and then you have a community, and then you have a town or a city, and then the state, and then the world. But here, because there are no families, it's easier for the World Council to run things, right? Because your loyalties then are going to be to the state rather than to your family. People begin in the Hall of Infants, and then when they end their lives, at the end of their lives, they go to the Home of the Useless, it's called. So very similar to the councils of the USSR and the way that things were structured there. People still had families in the USSR, but things were done to try to destabilize those families. Again, if you have loyalty to your wife or your husband or your parents or your siblings, and you have love for them, then you have less love and less loyalty to the leaders. In an anthem, science is controlled by these councils and the home of the scholars. So everyone lives in these homes collectively, right? There's the Hall of the Infants, where the infants are. There's the Home of the Useless, where the old are, which shows you, the value that they place on life and knowledge and wisdom of the elderly people. Home of the Scholars, there's the home of the street sweepers, there's the home of the teachers. So people are living in these cordoned off, siloed ways so that their only companions are the other people in their profession. So giving them that in common means that their work for the state is what they have in common, basically. So the idea here, though, is that science is controlled by these councils. So it's clear they suppress knowledge from others, and they don't want others to have access to scientific knowledge. But at the same point, they're unable to study it fully. So there is a scene with the Home of the Scholars that I really want you to pay attention to, because the experiments that equality is trying to do and the experiments that the scholars are trying to do, all of these are extremely rudimentary. But the way that he goes about trying to acquire knowledge is quite different from the way that they go about it. So pay attention especially to those scenes when looking at the science of the book. So here is an excerpt, and up in the corner I have a picture of the four winds. This is how the ancient people thought, or at least they sort of personified the winds. It's very difficult to tell whether they actually believed that or not, but they personified the winds as four people from four different corners. So here is our excerpt. This is equality speaking here. We loved the science of things. We wished to know. We wished to know all about the things which make the earth around us. We asked so many questions that the teachers forbade it. We think there are mysteries in the sky and under the water and in the plants which grow, but the council of scholars has said that there are no mysteries, and the council of scholars knows all things. And we learn much from our teachers. We learn that the earth is flat and that the sun revolves around it, which causes the day and night. We learn the names of all the winds which blow over the seas and push the sails of our great ships. We learned how to bleed men to cure all ailments. So you can kind of see a couple things going on here in this excerpt, right? First of all, that there is this council that is controlling things and suppressing knowledge. There are no mysteries. And if there are, the council would be the people that would discover the mysteries, right? Or solve the mysteries. We also see that further suppressing knowledge are teachers. So teachers are teaching only what the state tells them to teach, looking at only that curriculum. This is something that did happen and does happen in communist countries, that you're only allowed the state curriculum is only what is allowed to be taught. Sorry. It's only the thing that's allowed to be taught, and any deviation from that could get both the teachers and the students in trouble. So usually in a democracy, the idea of teaching is to lead people to independent and critical thinking. And it particularly not as much in elementary school, where you're sort of trying to teach people the basics, but as people get older, and particularly in college, that's the goal. My goal is not to tell you what to think or what to believe. My goal is to try to have you discover things on your own. And in this society in Anthem, it's the opposite that's happening, right? And then we sort of see the dark ages that this has led to. So the earth is flat, the sun revolves around the earth, there are the names of the winds, we bleed men to cure them of their ailments. So going back to that idea that men have humors in their blood, and the humors are what make them ill. And if you bleed them, they will become better, either by cutting or by leeches, possibly, right? So I think this is a pretty good demonstration of this concept in the book. I'm sorry for the extra noise. People are plowing in my driveway right now and on the street. I don't know if you guys can hear the rumbling. Sorry about that. Major themes in the book. The original title for the book was Ego, because as Ayn Rand said, she wanted it to be a hymn to man's ego, so the thing that drives us to be different. This is a quote of hers from a different book, but I wanted to put it in here because I think it applies to this one as well. It's so easy to run to others. It's so hard to stand on one's own record. You can fake virtue for an audience. You can't fake it in your own eyes. Your ego is your strictest judge. Looking at being virtuous just on your own without the state telling you what to do. Individuals being sacrificed for the good of the collective. Again, the loss of identity. But really, one of the ways that it comes out here is the motif, or the repeating element of names. And I'm going to write... There we go. There we go. A motif is an element that's repeated that sort of adds to a theme or contributes to a theme. So people are named things like liberty, equality, solidarity, fraternity, international, and then all of those names also have a number beside them. So what I'd like you to do is sort of, as you're reading, think about what those words might mean. Certainly we think of liberty differently, and how is that being interpreted? How is equality, which we proclaim as a virtue in our country, how is that being reinterpreted by this state that's in this book? Loss of freedom. As I said, people are given those names that are above. Jobs are chosen for them. Now, this is something that we're going to look at a lot more in the book Matched, having your job chosen for you. Everything is censored. Family units are non-existent. People are constantly under surveillance. I'm not having you read the book in 1984 because I think a lot of times people read that in high school, but it's sort of that same idea, right? That the people are always being watched by a centralized state. And once again, we're kind of stuck here. There we go. Okay, so in addition to being under surveillance constantly, selfishness is a sin. So being alone, doing things just for yourself that don't necessarily serve not just really the collective, but actually the state. To Rand, this is a virtue that we talked about last time, right, with her objectivism philosophy, that really man's relationship in terms of ethics is to himself rather than his fellow man. Other forms of selfishness, I said being alone, but showing preference, so preferring one thing over another. If everything's equal, you like an orange just as much as you like a banana or an apple, and preference particularly toward other people as well. So, liking one person more than another, calling someone your friend, falling in love. The pursuit of knowledge, also in addition to that, so knowledge outside of what the state has decided you should know, trying to go beyond their guidelines. The point of view in this book, is, I think, almost more important than some of our other books, and certainly more important than the next book we're going to be reading, Brave New World. Here, no one's happiness but my own is my power to achieve or destroy. So another quote from Ayn Rand about individuality. The story is told from Equality 7:25-21's point of view. It's supposed to be in the form of a secret diary. Because identity is a major theme in the work, the first person point of view is really vital to developing this theme, because basically what we see him is slowly going from a cog in the collective machine to a free-thinking individual. And there are things within the point of view that show this. So the word I has vanished from language. Equality uses the pronouns we and us and writes in the first person plural at the beginning of the novel. Now, over time, this changes, and we also see him grappling with how to write. As he becomes a more free-thinking individual, he struggles with what words to use when writing. He feels like the words that he wants don't exist, and he doesn't quite know how to say what he feels or to show what he's thinking. So that's something that I'd like you to look for. The development, it's almost the development of a point of view overall, because point of view, moving from just what the collective believes to what he believes. If you ever watch one of the Star Trek shows has this where someone has been part of the Borg Collective, a group of individuals that are under one collective sort of hive mind, and they use we and us, and when they split off, some of them begin to use other words to express themselves. So it's sort of the same idea. Here is an excerpt that kind of shows this. It is dark here. The flame of the candle stands still in the air. Nothing moves in this tunnel save our hand on the paper. We are alone here under the earth. It is a fearful word, alone. The laws say that none among men may be alone, ever, at any time, for this is the great transgression and the root of all evil. But we have broken many laws. We stole the candle from the larder of the home of the street sweepers. We shall be sentenced to 10 years in the palace of corrective detention if it be discovered. But this matters not. It matters only that the light is precious, and we should not waste it to write when we need it for that work which is our crime. Nothing matters save our work, our secret, our evil, our precious work. So what's going on here? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about symbolism in a moment. For Rand, because of her objectivist theories where one thing sort of equals another, the symbols are pretty apparent. The candle and the light of the candle versus the dark, right? That's the first thing. He is in the tunnel under the earth, the only place where he can kind of be outside of that surveillance. You can see also that the transgression and the root of all evil, in terms of Christianity or the Jewish tradition, the love of money is the root of all evil. Here, being alone is the root of all evil. It's the thing that leads to other sins. So having individuality, breaking away from the equality that has been imposed on people, that sort of thing, right? Breaking many laws. The candle from the larder, a larder is like the cupboard, right? Or the pantry, the home of the street sweepers. As I said, they all live in collective homes. You also have this idea of, stealing a candle is sentenced to 10 years in prison. If being discovered. So much of the Soviet Union and other communist countries too enforce very harsh policies upon their citizens. So this is sort of an extreme example. We should not, light is precious. We should not waste it to write when we need it for the work, which is our crime. So he's writing, and the idea of writing is extremely important in this book, in The Handmaid's Tale, and in Matched. Not as much in Brave New World, but in the other three books, the idea of writing, keeping a diary, having something written that is a form of self-expression is extremely important. Here, we see that the writing and the self-expression is important, but what matters more is the scientific work that he is trying to do. So the science here over and above the self-expression. It's his secret, it's precious, but it's evil at the same time. He doesn't quite understand how it could be evil, but he knows that to him it's important, and it's worth risking 10 years in jail, right? I think that is the biggest thing. If you understand the stakes for him in trying to make scientific discoveries, then you understand that the stakes are high, and you have a little bit more of a compulsion to feel for him. In all of these dystopian works, the central conflict is man versus society, and here his scientific work is part of that conflict. So, literary allusions. An allusion is a reference. I was going to go over the picture there probably. Allusion is a reference to something outside of the work. Usually to something, famous isn't quite the right word, but something that other people can identify with or identify. Gaia is known as Mother Earth. There's a picture of her. I found one of her in all gold because it's the name later of the golden one. Gaia is the great goddess of the early Greeks. She represents the earth and was worshipped as the universal mother. She created the universe in Greek mythology and also gave birth to both the Titans, the first gods, and the first race of man. So sort of Gaia is the mother of all. Her equivalent in Christianity would possibly be Eve, looking at Adam and Eve. Prometheus, another literary allusion that will come up later in the book. In Greek mythology, Prometheus is a hero who is credited with creating man out of clay. He defies the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity so that they will have light and knowledge. And here you can kind of see Prometheus in all his glory, carrying the torch, being the light giver, stealing it from the heavens. And here is man, ignorant and in darkness and about to receive this gift. So watch for those allusions toward the end of this short novelette. Symbolism. And as I mentioned before, not the subtle layered symbols that you'd see in other people's works because of her philosophical beliefs that, metaphysically one thing represents another almost exactly. So light representing knowledge and truth is pretty typical in many forms of literature. Hope, renewal, enlightenment, and darkness implies mystery, ignorance, or despair. A light in the forest, a fire, a candle, a light bulb. These are things that bring us light, right? So look for some of those symbols. On the opposite end, things that are described as dark or dingy. The homes that they live in, the streets, the tunnels, and etc. A forest. The symbol of a forest, we're going to look at again in our last book. Forest is often a sign of freedom. Things grow freely in a forest. You have unbridled nature in a forest, right? So it's quite unlike a garden where things are very planned out. Man cannot fully control nature. And so because of this, in dystopian works, nature often becomes a symbol for the things that the state or the collective or the World Council cannot control. It's also, in this particular novel, a bridge. So it's a bridge to freedom between the old world and some of the relics that they're going to be looking at later. So when the forest comes up, look for that and understand what it is symbolizing. The written word, as I said, he's writing a diary, so writing is forbidden from almost all citizens in this book. So types of writing that occur become very important. They're not just forms of self-expression like a diary, but they're also remnants of the past and reclaiming that history to move forward and to make new discoveries. I have this picture of Anne Frank here because I feel almost like, her book, which was written after this one, this is written by someone where writing is not just forbidden, she herself was forbidden. And I think that you can sort of see a shade of this in this work of fiction, that you have someone who is forbidden, what he's doing is forbidden, and he can go to prison or be put to death. And it's, again, an important thing to remember that this book of Anthem is sort of reflective of the harsh realities that were going on at the time and what could have happened had communism and had a totalitarian state not sort of been checked. But also that we can still see the remnants of this in countries today where there are harsh punishments and genocides and other things. So where do we see this dystopia today? 5 communist regimes still exist. China, large communist regimes. China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and Laos. They're also among the world's worst human rights offenders. And this is a picture, and we're going to focus just on North Korea, just as an example of some of the things that have happened. You can see how tall these statues are, right? There's a cult of the leaders here. So Kim Jong-il and his family, and the people forced to, or encouraged to at least, bow down to these statues. North Korea's atrocities include censorship of the press, of the internet, of cell phones. At one point, people weren't allowed to have cell phones at all. Then later, they were allowed to have cell phones at sort of a limited situation where there was no texting and no internet, but they could have phones, but only to call within the country. The internet was censored completely, and later it became the intranet. So instead of having the World Wide Web the way we do in the United States, what they actually have is a modified version where it is controlled completely by the North Korean officials. So if you look things up online, you are looking up and finding only what they decide to tell you. Certain classes of women were forced into prostitution. They also have forced abortion. So if women were thought to perhaps be impregnated by foreigners, they were forced to have an abortion because of that. If people were practicing religion, if people were thought to be political enemies, they were tortured and imprisoned for those things. In North Korea, science, like in the book Anthem, has sort of been suppressed. They are trying to make scientific advancements now, but for many years they did not. I'm going to also link for you guys an article that I found of a scientist who was able to escape North Korea. Basically, he talks about finding solutions to problems without global knowledge, but also only for the leaders. So the leaders were the Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un and their family are slightly overweight. And they wanted the scientists to find a way that they could eat food without becoming obese. So that was a thing that they were tasked with. A lot of the other work focused on just expanding the nuclear weapons program, trying to get the atomic bomb so that they would be competitive in that way. So focus on weapons as opposed to medicine for people. They're working without global knowledge, meaning that they're hemmed in and they can only work with other Koreans. North Koreans, not South Koreans. Foreign doctors who travel to North Korea find that people are relying on herbal folk remedies. So these things from, the past, similar to Rand's novel, right? Looking at bleeding people, for example, when they're sick, something like that. And not that herbal medicine can't work sometimes, but what they're trying to do is, treat something like cancer with an herbal remedy as opposed to a more modern method, because there's this distrust of the West, and having this enemy kind of further unites the people in this collective society where individuality is supposed to be erased so that you worship the people of the state instead. Similarly, in newly industrialized countries, a lot of times there is little scientific progress, insufficient, dedicated, inspired, motivated labor pool. So people are sort of downtrodden and they don't really want to go into the sciences. More than that, there's a lot of times no investment in science education, and research is dominated by people wanting weapons programs. Now, in some other countries, when we get into looking at The Handmaid's Tale, we'll talk more about Iran. Iran wanted to be more competitive, and so they really tried to invest into their science education programs. But in this case, and in the early days of the Soviet Union, that really wasn't a priority. And, again, I think this idea of history and rewriting history and erasing parts of history that we don't want. History and science are more linked together than we would think. And in these countries, there's a rewriting of both, because you can't have one without the other. You can't talk about great Western men who historically discovered these brilliant solutions to life's problems, like, say, transportation or medicine, without acknowledging that they were Western men and that they were not working for the state or within the guidelines of the state. And also to show that, in the past, that life might have been better. I will say, too, that, in dystopian fiction, something always happens that there is a war, there is a famine, there is a hostile takeover, and there's some sort of cataclysmic event that forces people to come out of that chaos and want things to be more regimented or regulated. We're going to talk about that when we get into Brave New World. But there's a reason that people want a structured society. They want to be safe. And North Korea went through years of war and came out of those wars wanting to be safe and wanting to have a leader to cling to. And so in some ways, the actions of other countries has definitely impacted them, and our country included, right, during the Korean War, but of other countries as well, even before the Korean War and going back. And that's something to remember too. This dystopia that in North Korea, this communist state with these human rights offenses, didn't just come out of nowhere. It came from a long history of problems, and it is in some ways a response to that history. So what I'd like you to consider when you look at the book, I don't, as I said, I don't agree with many of Rand's philosophies, and you might, and that's okay. But I think the book is a great introduction to her philosophies. So if you're interested in that, you can kind of see where she's coming from. And moreover, it's a great introduction to dystopian literature. It has, it's the shortest book we're going to be looking at, but it really has the bare bones are all there. You have a hero, you have a heroine, you have a conflict of them against the state, you have the idea of collectivism, the idea of a highly structured society under a central government. All of those things are there. And so I think you get the idea of dystopian literature, you know, in this short, I think it's about 50-page book. The book clearly demonstrates how she experienced the USSR as a totalitarian dystopia. So again, you can see her showing these extremes of communism and collectivism. And you can, you know, I talked about North Korea because I want you to kind of think about what we have here and the fears that some people have about communism to us now seem sort of distant and ridiculous. But to our parents, or to my parents, or for some of you to your grandparents, those fears were very real. And these are the things that they are worried about. So looking at history in that sense too, and understanding history through literature, I think is amazing. What happens when people turn away from facts? This is something I'd like you to think about as you're reading Anthem. They declare science evil and inquiry a sin. What would happen in our country if the Flat Earth Society took over? If there were enough people that believed that the earth was flat and that they really formed a collective and somehow got into the government, what would happen there? Would science be declared evil? Would we go back 600 years to believing the earth was flat? Would we lose the history of walking on the moon and of photography and of satellites and all of that? Would we lose progress and go back to another dark age? Considering those types of things, that fear. What happens when everything is stripped from you? So more than just science and history, but really your complete individuality. And what are the ways in which your individuality is taken away? I think that in our society in the United States, you're going to see this a lot more when we talk about Brave New World and the way that things are stripped from people in that society, where there's a more reliance on science as opposed to turning away from science, right? But for people living in those types of countries, no freedom of speech, no freedom of choice, no freedom even to prefer one thing over another, no family, no friends, no identity, and how might you react against that? How might you fight that? Or would you be so downtrodden and oppressed you wouldn't even know that you could fight it? That's the kind of thing that Rand talks about in this book. Yeah, there it is. Would you be able to rebel, or would you not even realize the possibility of rebellion? This is a quote from the book. "For they have nothing to fight me with, save the brute force of their numbers. I have my mind." That's sort of the key. Numbers and brute force of the collective versus one individual's mind. So that's what I'd like you to look at in the book. And finally, these are read-alikes. Read-alikes are, if you love this book and later on during the fall or during the rest of the school year, what else might you read if you enjoyed this book? We the Living is another book by Ayn Rand. And this book was actually her first novel. So We the Living is very much like, it's almost an autobiography. Ayn Rand never wrote an autobiography. She never wrote a book about herself and her life. But this book comes pretty close. And if you're interested in what I had to say about her life and you want to know a little bit more, We the Living takes place from 1922 to 1925 in Russia, just after the Revolution and the Civil War. And it features Kira, who's the protagonist, and she's the younger daughter of a bourgeois family. She is an independent spirit, and she goes to Petrograd, as Ayn Rand did, after an exile by the Bolsheviks. Her father had been the owner of a textile factory, which was seized, just like Ayn Rand's father's business was seized, and they gave up their possessions to the Bolsheviks. So there's a lot there with communism and having a free spirit and trying to break out of the mold that people are trying to cast you into. So a lot of the same similar sort of themes as Anthem, but I would say that Anthem is sort of Ayn Rand's vision of communist Russia 100 years after the revolution. We, by Yevgeny Zamatin, is a book that has been it has a lot of comparison. There have been a lot of comparisons made between this book and Anthem, and also this book and Brave New World, even though I think Brave New World and Anthem are quite different. But again, a book by someone who escaped communist Russia. So a dystopian work, but there you can sort of see that the scientific advancements. There's helicopters and possibly flying cars up there and things like that, but a very similar plot, just done in a completely different way. So it's an interesting book, and it's not that long either. Animal Farm is another short book. That's by George Orwell, who also wrote the book 1984. And Animal Farm is, I think, sort of fascinating for a short book. It's really taking a look at using animals like pigs and chickens, as you see there on the front. A horse is also involved. Animal Farm really examines the way in which a collectivist society is formed. So why people rebel, how they try to rebel, the results of their rebellion, and then also how sometimes when we rebel, we become like the thing we disdain. So at the end of the book, you kind of see the comparisons to the new society being very much like the old society, except sort of worse. And finally, A World Made by Hand. World Made by Hand is a newer book that I happened to pick up because I sort of liked the cover, and I thought the title was interesting. But the idea of the world made by hand is that in the near future, oil runs out, and so we don't have any fuel for cars, and then something else happens that takes out all the electricity as well. So people sort of go back to this idea of living almost like the Amish would live, or living as you would in the 17 or 1800s. And that's why it's called World Made by Hand. So you go back to, trying to relearn all the things that our society has forgotten. How to bake things without electricity. How to sew your own clothing, particularly without a sewing machine. I think what's interesting to me about that book is not just the science and the way that the science kind of takes a step back, but also how families are structured. What I also like about The World Made by Hand is that, like Anthem, we've stepped back in science, but unlike Anthem, it's a world that the dystopia is based on chaos instead of control. So for that reason, I think it's kind of a more interesting book, because a lot of dystopian fiction is based on the idea of a highly controlled state. And James Kunstler sort of asks, what if it went the opposite way and we went into sort of anarchy and chaos, and then we have communities that sort of try to reestablish themselves and work together to stave off the chaos and the problems, and to survive in this new world. So I hope that you enjoy reading Anthem, and I look forward to having discussions with all of you about the book and some of the themes in it, and how we see Ayn Rand's philosophies. And I think it'll set us up for a really nice longer discussion throughout the term about different types of dystopia and the ways that maybe we can avoid it. All right, thanks. Have a great day.